On the 6th of July, 1812, at 3 in the morning, a man sat hunched over a writing desk in the Bohemian spot town of Teplitz. The candle had burned low. His hair, wild and streaked with gray, fell across his forehead. He was 41 years old, and his hand trembled as he wrote. He was not writing music. The pen scratched across paper with furious intensity. Ink blots appeared where emotion overwhelmed precision. The words poured out in German, raw and unguarded. My angel, my all, my very self. Can I live without you? No. 3 pages. He filled 3 pages with the most passionate declaration of love ever written by a composer. He addressed it to a woman he called only Immortal Beloved. He spoke of impossible love, of sacrifice, of the agony of separation. And then he did something strange. He did not send the letter. 15 years later, after the man had died, his executors opened a secret drawer in his desk. Inside they found this letter, folded and worn from handling. He had read it many times. Beside it lay a miniature portrait of an unknown woman and bank shares worth a small fortune. The man was Ludwig van Beethoven. The mystery of that letter has haunted scholars for 2 centuries. Who was she? Dozens of theories have emerged. Married countesses, opera singers, the daughters of friends. Researchers have analyzed handwriting, cross-referenced travel records, studied watermarks on the paper. The debate continues today. But here is what matters most. The letter was never sent. The greatest musical genius of his age could not bring himself to mail 3 pages of confession. Why? Think about that for a moment. This was a man who defied emperors, who revolutionized music, who refused to bow before Napoleon. Yet he could not send a love letter. The answer to that question unlocks the strangest, most scandalous, and most magnificent life in the history of Western music. This is the story of a man who kidnapped a child from his mother, who fought in court for 5 years to possess his nephew, who drove that nephew to put a pistol to his own head, who was arrested as a vagrant because he looked like a madman, who could not hear the thunderous applause after his greatest symphony, who died during a lightning storm, raising his fist to the heavens. This is the story of Ludwig van Beethoven. And it begins not with music. It begins with violence. The boy did not know how old he was. His father lied about his age. And that was not the worst of his father's lies. Ludwig van Beethoven was baptized on the 17th of December, 1770, in the city of Bonn. He was probably born the day before, though no one recorded the exact date. This uncertainty would follow him throughout his life. Years later, when he requested a copy of his baptismal certificate, he discovered something unsettling. Another Ludwig van Beethoven had been baptized in the same church. An older brother, dead in infancy. For a moment, he wondered if he even knew who he truly was. The house on Bongas where he entered the world was cramped and dark. Low ceilings pressed down on its inhabitants. The family occupied rooms on the upper floors. In winter, damp crept through the walls. In summer, the smell of the nearby river hung in stagnant air. His grandfather, also named Ludwig, was the family's one bright spot. The elder Ludwig had risen to become Kapellmeister, music director, at the electoral court. He was respected, talented, dignified. But he drank, and his wife had been committed to a psychiatric institution. A curse waited in the bloodline. Mental instability. Alcoholism. These shadows would stretch across generations. The composer's father, Johann van Beethoven, inherited his own father's thirst for alcohol but none of his success. Johann had trained as a tenor. He held a position as a court musician. But his voice was unremarkable. His ambition exceeded his talent. When his famous father died in 1773, Johann found himself adrift. A mediocre singer with a growing family. A growing dependence on drink. It was Johann who first recognized that his eldest surviving son possessed extraordinary musical gifts. And it was Johann who decided to exploit them. The child prodigy Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had taken Europe by storm in the previous decade. He toured with his father, performing for kings and emperors. Johann sought his own ticket to fame in his young son's fingers. There was only one problem. By the time Ludwig showed his promise, he was already older than Mozart had been during his famous childhood tours. So Johann lied. He shaved 2 years off his son's age. When Ludwig gave his first public performance at around 8 years old, his father claimed he was fix. This deception continued for years. Ludwig himself grew uncertain of his true age. The confusion persisted into adulthood. But the lies about his birthday were trivial compared to what happened behind closed doors. The neighbors heard crying at night. But in those days, people did not interfere in family matters. Johann van Beethoven had a method for teaching music. He would wake his son in the middle of the night, drag him from bed, force him to practice at the keyboard for hours. Sometimes Johann was sober. More often, he was drunk. And when he was drunk, his temper flared at the slightest mistake. The boy would sit at the clavier, exhausted and terrified. His small fingers stumbled over passages his father demanded he play perfectly. When he erred, punishment was swift. A slap. A blow to the hands. Sometimes worse. One account describes a concert the young Ludwig gave for his father's drinking companions. The boy performed for these bleary-eyed men while his father watched with proprietary pride. When Ludwig made a mistake, Johann struck him across the hands in front of everyone. The child's eyes filled with tears, but he continued playing. There is no documentary proof of this specific incident, but the pattern it represents is well established. Johann pushed his son relentlessly, brutally, desperately. He needed the boy to succeed because his own career had stalled. He believed harsh discipline produced results. In a terrible way, he was right. Ludwig's mother, Maria Magdalena, offered little protection. She was a quiet woman, worn down by poverty, worn down by her husband's drinking, worn down by the deaths of several children in infancy. She had married Johann at 18. By all accounts, she found little happiness. One visitor described her as a serious woman who rarely smiled. She was already ill with the tuberculosis that would eventually kill her. What she gave her son was not protection but endurance. She modeled survival. She taught him, by example, that one could live through misery and keep going. Here is what we need to understand. The equation burned into this child's mind was simple and brutal. Music equaled pain. Success meant humiliation. Approval came only through suffering. This formula would shape everything that followed. He had learned his lessons well. In 1787, when Ludwig was 16, his mother died. Maria Magdalena had been ill for months. Tuberculosis ravaged her body. Ludwig had traveled to Vienna earlier that year, perhaps to study, perhaps to seek his fortune. But he rushed home when word reached him of her declining health. He arrived in time to watch her waste away. She died on the 17th of July. Ludwig was devastated. In a letter written shortly after, he called her his best friend. He spoke of the happiness of pronouncing the word mother to someone who would respond. The loss marked him permanently, but grief was a luxury he could not afford. His father's drinking had grown worse. 2 younger brothers depended on the family income. Caspar Karl and Nikolaus Johann needed food and shelter. Someone had to take charge. At 16, Ludwig did something that required extraordinary courage, or extraordinary desperation. He petitioned the elector's court to grant him half of his father's salary, paid directly to him. His argument was simple. Johann was incapable of managing the family's affairs. In effect, he asked the authorities to declare his own father legally incompetent. The petition was granted. Let that sink in. A teenager publicly humiliated his father, exposed the family's shame to official scrutiny. In small-town Bonn, this was a scandal. Everyone knew. Johann van Beethoven, already a figure of pity and contempt, was now reduced to living on his son's sufferance. For Ludwig, it was survival. His brothers needed food. The rent needed paying. His father was drinking away what little money remained. The teenager had no choice. But the experience taught him something else. Something dangerous. Legal mechanisms could be used to destroy someone who stood in your way. You could petition the courts and have a person set aside. Paper and procedure could be weapons. He would remember this lesson. 30 years later, when he wanted to take his nephew from the boy's mother, he would reach for the same tools. Watch this one. He will make the world talk about him. Mozart supposedly said these words after hearing the young Beethoven improvise at the keyboard. It happened during a visit to Vienna in the spring of 1787. 2 geniuses meeting. One ascending, one at his peak. A moment of prophetic recognition. There is only one problem. The meeting may never have happened. Ludwig did travel to Vienna in early 1787. This is documented. Mozart was living in the city, working on Don Giovanni. It is entirely possible that the young visitor sought out the famous composer, but no contemporary document records such a meeting. No letter from either party mentions it. The story first appears in accounts written years after both men had died. What does this mean? Perhaps the meeting occurred exactly as described. The lack of documentation is simply a gap in the historical record. Or perhaps the story was invented later. Those who built the Beethoven legend wanted apostolic succession. The torch of genius passed from master to student. If the meeting never happened, Then Ludwig spent his entire life without receiving blessing from his great predecessor. Mozart died in 1791. There would be no second chance. This matters because it helps explain something about his personality. His fierce, almost aggressive self-confidence. If you have received validation from an acknowledged master, you can afford humility. But if no one has confirmed your worth, you must validate yourself. You must insist on your own greatness. Throughout his life, Beethoven combined supreme confidence with knowing insecurity. He demanded respect while fearing he did not deserve it. He proclaimed himself equal to princes while wincing at reminders of his humble origins. The roots of this contradiction may lie in a meeting that never occurred. The man who freed Ludwig from Bonn was a young count with a passion for music. In 1788, Ferdinand Ernst Gabriel, Count von Waldstein, arrived at the electoral court. He was 26 years old, wealthy, well-connected, genuinely enthusiastic about the arts. He quickly recognized the extraordinary talent of the young musician and became his patron. Waldstein's support went beyond money. He arranged better training. He introduced Ludwig to influential people. He encouraged his ambitions. And when it became clear that Bonn was too small for such a talent, Waldstein helped plan his departure for Vienna. The Count had a gift for discretion. Understanding that the proud young musician might refuse charity, he gave money secretly. Ludwig believed it was his salary from the elector. Only later did he learn the truth. In October of 1792, as Ludwig prepared to leave Bonn forever, Waldstein wrote a farewell message in his album. The words were prophetic. Dear Beethoven, you are going to Vienna in fulfillment of your long-frustrated wishes. Mozart's genius still mourns and weeps for the death of its disciple. It found refuge with the inexhaustible tyrant. Through him it wishes to form a union with another. With the help of assiduous labor you shall receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands. Think about this statement. Waldstein was telling the young man he was destined to inherit the mantle of Mozart himself. Not as a student, as a successor. Ludwig set out for Vienna in November of 1792. He would never return to Bonn. Behind him, he left a father who would die within 2 months. 2 brothers who would follow him to Vienna years later, and memories of a childhood marked by violence and loss. He was 21 years old. He had almost no money. He had no powerful family connections. He had a letter of introduction to Haydn and a burning determination to succeed. He also carried something else. Patterns learned in childhood that would shape his relationships forever. He knew that love came with conditions. That trust led to betrayal. That people closest to you could hurt you most. And he knew that talent, properly weaponized, could be converted into freedom. But before we follow him to Vienna, we must pause for the small details that made him human. He could not multiply. This seems impossible for a man who would compose works of mathematical precision, structures of perfect proportion. But it was true. Throughout his life, Ludwig van Beethoven struggled with basic arithmetic. When he needed to multiply, he added, laboriously, repeatedly, counting on his fingers like a schoolchild. He could hear a wrong note in an orchestra of 60 musicians. He could construct symphonic architectures of unprecedented complexity. but simple multiplication defeated him. This contradiction characterized his entire life. He could compose music that moved audiences to tears, but he could not maintain a household. He could hear harmonies no one else imagined, but he could not hear the needs of people around him. Already in youth, the patterns were visible. His hair was wild, resistant to grooming. His clothes were often dirty, carelessly worn. When he walked through streets, he muttered to himself. Conducted invisible orchestras with his hands. Oblivious to stares. He developed rituals to impose order on his chaotic existence. Later in life, he would count exactly 60 coffee beans for each cup. No more. No less. The precision was almost pathological. It suggested a desperate need for control. At least in one small area of a life spinning constantly out of control. He loved coffee. He poured water over his head when he needed to think. Soaked the floor beneath him. Drove his landladies to despair. He changed residences constantly. By some counts, more than 60 times during his years in Vienna. Always convinced that the current apartment was inadequate. That neighbors were too noisy. That the landlord was cheating him. These were not the habits of a comfortable man. They were the habits of someone perpetually at war with his environment. Someone who could find peace only in the abstract realm of musical composition. The real world was too loud. Too messy. Too unpredictable. Only on the page, in the perfect silence of written notes, could he achieve the control he craved. Vienna in 1792 was the musical capital of Europe. Mozart had died there just the year before, leaving a void that lesser talents scrambled to fill. Joseph Haydn, now in his 60s, was the acknowledged master. The aristocracy competed for the best performers, maintaining private orchestras, hosting lavish musical evenings. A young virtuoso with sufficient talent could rise quickly. Ludwig arrived with a letter of introduction to Haydn and began taking lessons from the old master. It was an honor most musicians would have treasured. He found it intolerable. The lessons went badly from the start. Haydn was distracted, preparing for an extended trip to England, occupied with his own compositions. His teaching was casual, sometimes careless. He would glance at his students' exercises, make a few corrections, and move on. For a young man burning with ambition, this was inadequate. So Ludwig did something revealing. He secretly arranged lessons with other teachers. Johann Schenk. Then Johann Georg Albrechtsberger. He continued seeing Haydn while learning from others on the side. The deception worked, after a fashion. He learned counterpoint and composition from his secret teachers while maintaining the prestigious connection to Haydn. But when the old master suggested that Ludwig should sign his works pupil of Haydn, the young man's temper flared. "I learned nothing from you," he reportedly said. It was ungrateful, arrogant, probably unfair. Haydn's influence, even if indirect, had shaped his development. But for Ludwig, any acknowledgement of debt was submission. And submission was intolerable. The roots of this reaction lay in childhood. His father had demanded obedience and repaid it with violence. Waldstein had helped him secretly precisely because open patronage would have seemed like charity. Ludwig had learned that dependence was dangerous. Those who helped you could also hurt you. Gratitude created vulnerability. He would maintain this pattern throughout his life, alienating friends and supporters with his refusal to acknowledge what he owed them. The price of his independence was loneliness. It was a sport for the wealthy, watching musicians destroy each other at the keyboard. The piano duel was popular entertainment in Viennese salons during the 1790s. Two virtuosos would take turns at the instrument, improvising on themes, displaying technique, attempting to outshine each other. The audience would judge, applaud, declare a winner. Ludwig van Beethoven never lost. In 1799, he faced Joseph Wölfel, a respected pianist with formidable technique. Wölfel's hands were enormous, capable of reaching intervals most pianists could only dream of. His playing was clean, precise, elegant. Ludwig's approach was different. He played with savage intensity, attacking the keyboard as if it were an enemy. His improvisations ranged from delicate beauty to thunderous power. He did not merely perform. He overwhelmed. The audience gave him the victory. The following year, he faced Daniel Steibelt, a fashionable composer known for virtuoso tremolo effects.
Steibelt was confident, even cocky. He performed a showy piece built around his signature technique. The audience applauded politely. Then Ludwig sat down. He took Steibelt's music, placed it upside down on the stand. With one finger, he picked out the theme, exposing its banality with cruel precision. Then he improvised on that theme for 30 minutes, transforming it into something Steibelt could never have imagined. Steibelt left before the improvisation ended. He refused to be in the same room with Beethoven ever again. There was something cruel in these performances. Ludwig was not content to win. He wanted to humiliate. He wanted opponents to feel small, to understand they were not merely defeated but annihilated. The aggression beaten into him as a child found an outlet at the keyboard. But there may have been another motivation. Something that makes the cruelty more understandable. By 1799, Ludwig had begun to notice something terrifying. A ringing in his ears that would not go away. Difficulty hearing high frequencies. The first symptoms of the deafness that would eventually engulf him. If you knew your career as a performing virtuoso would soon be over, you might also want to establish dominance while you still could. You might want everyone to remember who was the greatest. Before the silence closed in, they invited him into their homes. They did not invite him into their families. Prince Karl Lichnowsky was among the first Viennese aristocrats to recognize Beethoven's genius. He gave the young composer rooms in his own palace. He provided an annual stipend. He treated him almost as a member of the household. The arrangement was generous and suffocating. Ludwig was expected to dine with the prince, to perform for guests, to conform to the household schedule. For a man who valued independence above all else, this was torment. Yet he stayed. He needed the money, the connections, the access to society. So he learned to navigate the aristocratic world. A world of rigid hierarchies and elaborate courtesies. Where a musician, no matter how brilliant, remained a kind of superior servant. The women of this world fascinated him. Countesses and baronesses. Elegant and educated. Fluent in French. Accomplished in music. They took lessons from him. They flirted with him. They filled his imagination with romantic possibilities. But when he proposed marriage, they refused. Giulietta Guicciardi was 16 when she became his student in 1801. She was beautiful, charming, obviously smitten with her famous teacher. Ludwig fell deeply in love. He dedicated his piano sonata No. 14 to her. The piece the world would later call the Moonlight Sonata. He asked for her hand. Her family said no. He was not noble. His origins were humble. His income uncertain. His manners rough. His appearance unkempt. His temper volcanic. Whatever his genius, he was not suitable for a countess. Giulietta married Count Wenzel Robert Gallenberg. A mediocre composer with a respectable title. The marriage was unhappy. Years later, according to Beethoven's own account, she came to him in tears. By then, he had hardened. "I despised her," he wrote. Josephine von Brunswick was a young widow when Ludwig met her in 1804. She had 4 children from her first marriage. A vulnerability that touched him. Their relationship deepened into something that looked very much like love. 13 letters from Ludwig to Josephine survive. Passionate and tender. They seemed destined for marriage. Then, suddenly, the relationship ended. Why? The most likely explanation involves family pressure and legal complications. If Josephine remarried beneath her station, she might lose custody of her children. Her family made clear that a union with a commoner was unacceptable. In 1810, he proposed to Therese Malfatti, another pupil, another aristocrat. Her father refused. 3 women. 3 refusals. The pattern was clear. Ludwig could win admiration from the highest social circles. But he could not win acceptance as an equal. His genius was celebrated. His person was deemed unsuitable. The refusals wounded him deeply. But perhaps they also served a purpose. Loving from a distance was safer than loving up close. An impossible romance demanded nothing real. No compromise. No vulnerability. No daily negotiation. Remember the letter we started with? The Immortal Beloved? We are getting closer to its secret. But first, he had to face something worse than heartbreak. He had to face silence. Around 1798, he began to hear a sound that was not there. It started as a ringing. A high-pitched tone that persisted in the background of his awareness. He noticed trouble following conversations. Especially when multiple people spoke at once. High frequencies seemed to fade first. He would ask people to repeat themselves. Then pretend he had heard when he had not. He told almost no one. For a musician, especially a performing virtuoso, deafness was a death sentence. His career depended on his ears. His income required public performance. If word spread that he was losing his hearing, commissions would dry up. Students would vanish. Invitations would cease. He had to keep the secret as long as possible. He consulted physicians. They prescribed treatments that ranged from useless to painful. Oils dripped into the ear canal. Baths in cold water. Applications of tree bark. Nothing helped. The ringing grew louder. The silence grew deeper. To hide his condition, he withdrew from social situations where his deafness might be exposed. He avoided large gatherings. He kept conversations short. He cultivated a reputation for eccentricity and rudeness. This provided cover for his inability to hear what people said. Those who knew him during these years often found him arrogant and unsociable. They did not know the real reason. By 1802, the symptoms had progressed to a point where concealment was becoming impossible. He could not continue living like this. Pretending. Hiding. Watching his world shrink into silence. He needed to make a decision. In October of 1802, Ludwig traveled to the village of Heiligenstadt, just outside Vienna. His doctors had recommended country air. He was 31 years old. And he was preparing to die. Not physically. His health was reasonable apart from his ears. But the life he had known, the life of a performing virtuoso, a brilliant improviser, a master of the keyboard, that life was ending. Soon everyone would know. The great Beethoven was going deaf. In a small house in Heiligenstadt, he sat down and wrote a letter to his two brothers. He called it his will, though it was more confession than testament. He never sent it. The document was found among his papers after his death, 25 years later. We call it the Heiligenstadt Testament. The words pour out in anguish. Oh, you men who think or say that I am hostile, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause of what seems thus to you. He describes the humiliation of standing next to someone who hears a distant flute while he hears nothing. He writes of a shepherd singing in the fields. A sound that reaches everyone except him. For me there can be no recreation in the society of my fellows. No refined conversations. No mutual exchange of ideas. I must live like an exile. And then comes the confession that reveals how close he came to the edge. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt was within me, and so I spared this wretched life. Let that sink in. He considered ending his life. Only art stopped him. Only the conviction that he had more music to write. More of himself to give to the world. This alone kept him from the abyss. The Heiligenstadt Testament marks a turning point. Before it, he was a brilliant young virtuoso with a promising future. After it, he was something else. A composer who knew his time was limited. Who understood he must work with desperate urgency. Who had chosen to live for his art because nothing else remained. The music he wrote in the years following Heiligenstadt is different from what came before. Bolder. Stranger. More willing to challenge convention. The Eroica Symphony. The Waldstein Sonata. The Appassionata. These works announce a new ambition. Having accepted his fate, he was free to pursue greatness without distraction. The man who emerged from Heiligenstadt was harder than the one who entered. He had looked into the void and survived. He would never be easy to live with again. He tore the title page with such fury that his pen pierced the paper. It was May of 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte, the hero of the French Revolution, had just declared himself emperor. The news reached Vienna. And Ludwig van Beethoven erupted in rage. For years, he had admired Napoleon. Here was a man who, like himself, had transcended humble origins through sheer force of will. Napoleon had overthrown the old aristocratic order. Had proclaimed the rights of man. Had shown that birth did not determine destiny. To a composer who had suffered countless humiliations because of his common blood, this was intoxicating. Ludwig had been working on a massive new symphony. His third. He intended to dedicate it to Napoleon. The title page read, Sinfonia Grande, intitolata Bonaparte. Grand Symphony, titled Bonaparte. Then came the news of the coronation. His student Ferdinand Ries was present when Ludwig learned what had happened. Ries later described the scene. He flew into a rage and cried out, "So he is nothing but an ordinary man. Now he too will trample on all the rights of humanity and serve only his own ambition. He will exalt himself above all others and become a tyrant." Ludwig seized the title page. Tore it from top to bottom. Threw it on the floor. When the symphony was finally published, it bore a different dedication, composed to celebrate the memory of a great man. The great man was no longer Napoleon. Or rather, it was the Napoleon who might have been. The ideal that had been betrayed. This is important. This was not merely a political reaction. It was deeply personal. Ludwig had seen in Napoleon a mirror of himself. The outsider who conquers through genius. Who forces the world to recognize worth despite origins. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor, he became just another member of the ruling class. Just another aristocrat who would look down on common men. The betrayal cut deep. And the symphony that emerged from this crisis, the Eroica, was unlike anything that had come before. Longer. Louder. More emotionally intense than any previous symphony. Its funeral march mourned not just a hero but an ideal. Its finale celebrated not victory but survival. The Eroica announced that Beethoven would no longer write music to please patrons or follow conventions. He would write what he felt. Regardless of expectations. The comfortable world of 18th-century music was over. A new era had begun. And its prophet was a deaf man who had lost his faith in heroes. Now we return to the question that opened our story. The letter that was never sent. The woman he called Immortal Beloved. 13 letters survive from Ludwig to Josephine von Brunswick, written between 1804 and 1807. They are among the most passionate documents he ever produced. The only one whom I could love, he called her this. My heart is full of things to say to you, there are moments when I feel that speech is nothing at all. Josephine was not like the other women who attracted him. She was a widow, not a princess to be worshipped from afar. She had 4 children from her first marriage. She had known hardship. Her husband had left debts. Her health was fragile. Her position precarious. She was real in a way that Giulietta Guicciardi had never been. Their connection deepened over months of piano lessons and intimate conversations. Ludwig visited her frequently. He wrote letters that trembled with emotion. By 1805, they seemed to be moving toward marriage. Then something changed. The letters grew less frequent. His tone became more desperate, more pleading. By 1807, the relationship had ended. Josephine remarried 2 years later. A man of her own class. Why did they separate? The evidence points to family pressure and legal complications. The terms of Josephine's first marriage included provisions that could strip her of custody if she remarried beneath her station. Her family made clear that a match with a commoner was unacceptable, regardless of his genius. She had to choose between her children and her heart. She chose her children. Modern scholars have argued persuasively that Josephine is the most likely candidate for the Immortal Beloved. The dates align. The geography fits. The emotional intensity of the 1812 letter matches what we know of their relationship. And there is suggestive evidence. In 1813, Josephine gave birth to a daughter whose father was never officially identified. The timing is right for the child to have been conceived around July of 1812. Precisely when the Immortal Beloved letter was written. The daughter was named Minona. She lived a quiet life and never married. If she was Ludwig's child, the secret died with her. No DNA test has ever been conducted on her descendants. The question remains open. We cannot prove this theory. We may never know for certain who inspired those 3 desperate pages. But all the candidates share something in common. They were unavailable. Married. Constrained by family. Separated by class. The Immortal Beloved, whoever she was someone he could not have. Perhaps this was not an accident. Perhaps Ludwig was drawn to impossible loves precisely because they were impossible. Real relationships demanded vulnerability. Compromise. Daily negotiation. They required him to hear what another person was saying. Literally and emotionally. A distant beloved, idealized and unattainable, asked nothing of him except longing. The letter itself supports this interpretation. Even as he declares his passion, he acknowledges that union is impossible. Be calm, love me, today, yesterday, what tearful longing for you, you, my life, my all, farewell. Oh, continue to love me, never misjudge the most faithful heart of your beloved. Ever thine. Ever mine. Ever ours. Ever ours. But never actually together. He spent 10 years on a single opera. 3 different versions. Multiple failures. Each time, he revised, rewrote, and tried again. The opera was called Fidelio. Its plot obsessed him in ways his other works did not. A woman named Leonore disguises herself as a man. She takes a job as a prison guard. Her husband Florestan has been unjustly imprisoned by a political enemy. She risks everything to save him. In the climactic scene, she throws herself between her husband and the executioner's knife, revealing her identity and her love. The opera premiered in 1805 to a half-empty theater. Vienna was occupied by French troops. The usual audience had fled. It was revised and restaged in 1806. Failed again. Finally, in 1814, a third version achieved success. Why did this particular story matter so much? Consider what it represents. Absolute devotion. Leonore loves her husband so completely that she will sacrifice everything for him. Her freedom. Her safety. Her identity. She transforms herself into something unrecognizable in order to reach him. Her love is active, heroic, redemptive. This was what Ludwig wanted and never found. He dreamed of a woman who would brave any obstacle to be with him. Who would defy her family, her class, the conventions of society. He wanted to be loved with the fierce totality that Leonore shows Florestan. The women in his life chose otherwise. Giulietta married a count. Josephine submitted to family pressure. Therese Malfati's father said no. They were sensible choices, perhaps. They were not the stuff of opera. Fidelio allowed him to create, in art, the love that eluded him in life. For 2 hours on stage, absolute devotion was possible. The finale's cry of freedom expressed a joy he had never personally experienced. The opera remains his only work in the genre. He found the form frustrating. The collaborative demands exhausting. The practical limitations maddening. But he returned to it again and again. Driven by a need that no symphony could satisfy. In the autumn of 1821, a curious figure was spotted wandering the outskirts of Baden, a resort town near Vienna. He wore an old coat, badly worn. He had no hat. His hair stood out in wild disarray. He was peering through windows. Perhaps looking for food. Perhaps simply lost. The local police arrested him as a vagrant. "I am Beethoven," he protested. "Of course you are," the officer replied. "And why not the emperor? You certainly don't look like Beethoven." He spent the night in custody while authorities tried to determine whether this disheveled madman was telling the truth. Finally, someone thought to summon the local music director, a man named Herzog. He confirmed the prisoner's identity. The next morning, the mayor arrived with profuse apologies. He offered his carriage to convey the composer back to his lodgings. The incident reveals how completely Ludwig had detached from ordinary life. He looked like a vagabond because he did not notice or care about his appearance. He wandered into unfamiliar areas because he was lost in thought. Following inner music rather than external directions. He had become the cliché of the mad artist. So absorbed in his genius that he could not manage basic tasks of daily existence. For those who loved his music, the story was charming. Evidence of his otherworldly dedication to art. For those who lived with him, it was something else. Proof that he existed in a world of his own. Unable to see or respond to the needs of others. The man who could not find his way home from a walk was the same man who demanded absolute control over a teenager's life. The contradiction was not lost on his nephew Karl. His uncle claimed to know what was best for him. But could not dress himself properly. Could not navigate to the neighboring town. Something had to give. By 1814, his deafness had progressed to the point where conversation was difficult and musical performance nearly impossible. He still conducted. Still appeared on stage. But he could no longer trust his ears. He relied on visual cues. On the movements of musicians. On memory of how the music should sound. That year, the Congress of Vienna brought together the rulers and diplomats who would reshape the continent after Napoleon's defeat. Emperors, kings, and princes descended on the Austrian capital. Months of negotiation and celebration. The greatest gathering of power Europe had seen in generations. And Ludwig van Beethoven was the official composer of the festivities. He wrote works for the occasion. The Glorious Moment, a cantata celebrating the Allied victory. Wellington's Victory, a bombastic battle piece that reproduced cannon fire and trumpet calls. These were not his greatest compositions. He knew it. Posterity has agreed. They were propaganda set to music. Designed to flatter the powerful and please crowds. But they made him famous beyond anything he had achieved before. Wellington's Victory was a sensation. Audiences who had struggled with his symphonies embraced this accessible celebration of military triumph. For a moment, he was the most popular composer in Europe. The irony was savage. His profound works, the late quartets, the final piano sonatas, would be appreciated only by later generations. But jingoistic noise earned him applause from kings. And he could not hear any of it. At one performance during the Congress, he stood before the orchestra, beating time with passionate intensity. The musicians had learned to watch the concertmaster instead, following the first violin's lead while pretending to follow the composer. When the music ended, Ludwig continued to conduct. He was facing the orchestra, moving his arms, unaware that silence had fallen. Someone had to touch his shoulder and turn him around to see the audience's reaction. He saw them standing, cheering, waving handkerchiefs in the air. He could not hear a sound. This would become a recurring image in his later years. The deaf composer, cut off from the very music he created. Dependent on the eyes of others to know whether he had succeeded or failed. The isolation was complete. He lived in a bubble of silence. Surrounded by noise he could not perceive. He tried everything. Ear trumpets of various designs. Curved and flared. Meant to funnel sound into his damaged ears. Resonating plates attached to his pianos. Intended to transmit vibrations through the wood. He pressed his head against the instrument. Feeling rather than hearing the notes he played. His friends and patrons sent gifts intended to help. In 1803, the French piano maker Sébastien Erard sent him a new instrument. In 1818, the English firm Broadwood shipped a specially constructed grand piano across the Channel and over the Alps. A gesture of homage to his genius. The Broadwood had a more powerful tone than Viennese instruments. The makers hoped it might penetrate his diminishing hearing. It helped, a little, for a while. But the deafness was progressive. Relentless. By 1818 or 1819, he was effectively deaf. The sounds of the world had retreated behind an impenetrable wall. His final piano, built by Conrad Graf in 1825, included modifications designed specifically for him. A resonating chamber that amplified vibrations. A mechanism that sustained notes longer. He could still feel the music, even if he could not hear it. Visitors to his apartments reported that he played with tremendous force. Pounding the keys as if trying to break through to sound itself. The neighbors complained. The instrument suffered. He broke strings constantly. damaged hammers, wore-out mechanisms with the violence of his attack. He was not performing for an audience. He was fighting against silence. From 1818 onward, the only way to communicate with Ludwig was in writing. He could no longer hear well enough to follow spoken conversation. Visitors would write their questions and comments in small notebooks. He would respond aloud. These conversation books are an extraordinary historical resource. About 400 of them survive. They offer an unfiltered glimpse into the daily life of a genius. We see him negotiating with publishers, suspicious that they are cheating him, demanding better terms with persistence that bordered on paranoia. We see him discussing his nephew's health, the quality of food, the behavior of servants. We see gossip about mutual acquaintances, complaints about noise from neighboring apartments, arguments about politics. And we see his isolation. Page after page of other people's handwriting, with gaps where his responses would have been. The visual effect is haunting. A man surrounded by words he cannot hear, dependent on the patience of others to bridge the silence. Some visitors found the experience exhausting. Conversations that would take minutes in normal speech stretched into lengthy written exchanges. The spontaneity of dialogue disappeared, replaced by the labor of transcription. Many people simply stopped visiting. Those who persisted encountered a man who was by turns charming and irritable, generous and suspicious, brilliant and petty. His mood swung unpredictably. A pleasant conversation could turn hostile without warning. His famous temper had become even more explosive. Deafness cut him off from the social feedback that might have moderated his behavior. The conversation books contain moments of startling rudeness. Gay. Bauer. Get out, peasant, he told one unfortunate choirmaster who had displeased him. The insult was written down, preserved for posterity. A reminder that genius does not guarantee kindness. But there are also moments of tenderness, particularly in entries concerning his nephew. Despite everything, the control, the surveillance, the suffocating attention, Ludwig loved Karl. The conversation books record his anxious questions about the boy's health, his pride in Karl's academic achievements, his plans for the young man's future. It was a terrible love. But it was love nonetheless. And now we must turn to the darkest chapter of this story. The battle for a child's soul. The war that would culminate in blood. This was the man who wrote the Ode to Joy. Keep that in mind as you hear what he did next. In November of 1815, Ludwig's brother Caspar Karl died. He was 31 years old. He left behind a wife named Johanna and a 9-year-old son, also named Karl. In his will, Caspar Karl had appointed 2 guardians for the boy. His brother Ludwig, and his wife Johanna. They were to share responsibility for Karl's upbringing. Ludwig had other ideas. Within days of his brother's death, he launched a campaign to remove Johanna from any role in her own son's life. He petitioned the courts. He called her unfit. He accused her of immorality, corruption, of being a danger to the child. He called her the Queen of the Night, a reference to the villain in Mozart's Magic Flute. The name stuck. For the next 5 years, he would wage war against this woman with every weapon at his disposal. What had she done to deserve such hatred? She had been convicted of a minor theft some years earlier, embezzling household funds from her employer before her marriage. This was the evidence Ludwig wielded most effectively. But the crime was old. The amount was small. She had served her punishment. It hardly justified the campaign of destruction he waged against her. The deeper truth was simpler. Ludwig wanted the boy for himself. He had never had children. He had never had a wife. Caspar Karl's son represented his last chance at family. At legacy. At the kind of love he had never been able to secure. And so he went to war. Not with music this time. But with lawyers and courts and the grinding machinery of the legal system. He would spend 5 years and considerable resources trying to possess a child who did not want to be possessed. The court battles began immediately and continued until 1820. In 1815, Ludwig petitioned the Landrecht, the court that handled cases involving the nobility, for sole guardianship of his nephew. His argument rested partly on character assassination of Johanna, and partly on a legal technicality. He claimed that the van in his family name indicated noble status. This would give the aristocratic court jurisdiction. He was wrong. Van, in Dutch and German usage, does not denote nobility the way van does. The Landrecht eventually discovered this and transferred the case to the ordinary civil magistrate. A humiliating blow to his pretensions. But he persevered. He testified against Johanna. He presented witnesses. He wrote letters to influential friends, begging them to intervene on his behalf. The case dragged on through appeals and counter-appeals. Accusations and rebuttals. Young Karl was caught in the middle. He was forced to testify against his own mother in court. He was 12 years old. At various points in the proceedings, custody shifted back and forth. Johanna won temporary victories, only to see them reversed on appeal. Ludwig spent freely on legal costs, determined to prevail regardless of expense. In 1820, the matter was finally settled. Ludwig van Beethoven became the sole guardian of his nephew Karl. He had won. But the victory would prove hollow. "I have never been in a prison," the boy said, "but this is what I imagine it would be like." Karl van Beethoven was speaking of life with his uncle. He was a teenager when he made this statement. And he had endured years of his guardian's suffocating attention. Ludwig loved his nephew. Of this there can be no doubt. But his love took the form of control. Obsessive, invasive, inescapable control. He monitored the boy's correspondence. He restricted contact with his mother. He changed Karl's schools repeatedly. Convinced that teachers were conspiring with Johanna to corrupt the child. He read Karl's diary. He interrogated servants about the boy's movements. He burst into schools to confront administrators who had displeased him. He beat servants he suspected of smuggling letters between Karl and his mother. The pattern was familiar. Ludwig was recreating the dynamic of his own childhood. But with a terrible twist. His father had been a drunken failure whose abuse was driven by frustration. Ludwig was a celebrated genius whose control was justified, in his own mind, by the certainty that he knew best. No one dared contradict him. His fame insulated him from the consequences of his behavior. Karl responded as many children do to suffocating parents. He lied. He evaded. He sought escape. He began stealing small amounts of money. He developed relationships his uncle would not have approved. He fantasized about freedom. And as the years passed, he began to think about a more permanent escape. While he waged war for custody of Karl, Ludwig was also composing his most ambitious work. The Ninth Symphony. He had wanted to set Friedrich Schiller's poem Ode to Joy since his youth in Bonn. Now, deaf and aging, he finally found the form to contain it. A symphony of unprecedented length and ambition. Culminating in a choral finale that proclaimed the brotherhood of all humanity. Freude, schöner Götterfunken. Joy, beautiful spark of the divine. Alle Menschen werden Brüder. All men shall become brothers. The contradiction is almost too painful to examine directly. Here was a man capable of imagining universal love. Of setting to music the vision of a world where all men become brothers. Where joy unites what custom has divided. And here was the same man reading his nephew's diary. Beating servants who carried letters. Changing schools at the slightest suspicion of conspiracy. How do we reconcile these two realities? Perhaps the answer is that music was his escape from himself. In composition, he could become the person he wished he were. Magnanimous. Transcendent. Capable of love without conditions. On the page, he could love without the risk of rejection. Connect without vulnerability. Give without demanding control in return. The Ninth Symphony is not autobiography. It is aspiration. It represents not who Ludwig van Beethoven was, but who he desperately wanted to be. In life, he could not embrace millions. He could barely embrace one nephew without crushing him. The premiere took place on the 7th of May, 1824. It would be the last time Ludwig appeared in public as a conductor. He insisted on leading the orchestra. Though everyone knew he could not hear the musicians. The actual conductor, Michael Umlauf, had secretly agreed with the performers. They would follow his baton from the corners of their eyes, while pretending to follow the composer. Ludwig stood before them, beating time to music only he could hear. The symphony unfolded. The mysterious opening. The furious energy of the first movement. The titanic scherzo. The sublime variations of the slow movement. And then the finale. The revolutionary gesture of human voices in a symphony. The bass soloist's recitative rejecting all that came before. The simple tune that becomes an anthem for humanity. Seid umschlungen, Millionen. Embrace, ye millions. Diesen Kuss der ganzen Welt. This kiss for all the world. The choir sang words Ludwig could not hear. Expressing emotions he could never quite access in life. When the symphony ended, he did not know. He was still conducting. still moving his arms in patterns that corresponded to no sound. The orchestra had stopped playing. The audience was on its feet, cheering, weeping, waving handkerchiefs in the air. He did not know. He could not hear them. The contralto soloist, Caroline Unger, stepped forward. She touched his shoulders gently, and turned him around to face the house. Then he saw thousands of people standing, applauding, overcome with emotion, hats thrown into the air, tears streaming down faces. A reception more rapturous than any he had ever received. He could not hear a single sound, but he could see what his music had done. For one moment, the isolation lifted. For one moment, he was connected to the thousands who had gathered to witness his creation. For one moment, the silence did not matter. Because what he had to say had been said in music. And the music had been heard. By 1826, the pressure on Karl had become unbearable. He was 19 years old. He had just failed his examinations at the Polytechnic Institute. A humiliation that would require him to repeat the year. His uncle responded to this failure with characteristic fury. Accusations. Recriminations. Demands for explanation. More surveillance. More control. More of the suffocating attention that had defined Karl's adolescence. The boy saw only one way out. In July of 1826, Karl purchased 2 pistols from a Viennese gunsmith. He left the city and traveled to the ruins of Rauhenstein. A crumbling medieval tower overlooking the Hellenental Valley near Baden. It was a spot favored by romantic tourists. A picturesque relic against a backdrop of forested hills. On this summer day, it would become the site of a desperate act. Karl raised the first pistol to his head and fired. The bullet grazed his skull but did not penetrate. Stunned and bleeding, he raised the second pistol and fired again. The second bullet lodged in the bone above his ear. It did not kill him. He was found by a passing driver and transported to his mother's house. Not to his uncle's apartment. To the home of the woman Ludwig had spent 5 years trying to destroy. Johanna received her wounded son and summoned a doctor. When police questioned Karl, attempted suicide was a criminal offense, he gave a simple explanation for his act. My uncle tormented me too much. I grew weary of imprisonment. The word he used was Gefängnis. Prison. The same word he had used before to describe life under his uncle's guardianship. He had finally attempted to escape the only way he thought possible. Ludwig learned of the suicide attempt shortly after it occurred. His reaction, according to witnesses, was not primarily grief. It was rage. He wrote a terse note. It happened. He immediately began strategizing how to regain control of the situation. How to minimize the scandal. How to use his connections to keep Karl out of criminal prosecution. How to prevent Johanna from capitalizing on the disaster. Even now, with his nephew's blood still wet on the bandages, Ludwig could not see beyond his own needs. The intervention succeeded. Karl was spared prosecution. But the wound, both physical and psychological, had changed everything. Ludwig could no longer maintain the fiction that his guardianship had been beneficial. His nephew had tried to kill himself rather than continue living under his care. The conversation books from this period show visitors gently suggesting changes. Perhaps less supervision. Less control. Less attention. Ludwig resisted. But his position had been fatally weakened. Karl would never live with his uncle again. After recovering from his injuries, he joined the army. A career his uncle had always opposed. But could no longer prevent. Military service offered what Ludwig's household never had. Structure without suffocation. Discipline without surveillance. A clear path forward that did not depend on a deaf genius's unpredictable moods. The relationship did not end entirely. Uncle and nephew corresponded. Met occasionally. Maintained a connection of sorts. But the suicide attempt had shattered whatever remained of trust. Karl had shown, in the most dramatic way possible, that he preferred death to his uncle's love. Ludwig was left to confront the consequences of his obsession. The boy he had fought for 5 years to possess had tried to escape through self-destruction. The family he had tried to create had rejected him with bullets. In September of 1826, Ludwig traveled with Karl to the estate of his brother Johann at Nixendorf, a village in the Austrian countryside. The purpose was recuperation. Karl needed time to heal. Ludwig needed to escape the whispers and stares of Vienna. But the visit went badly from the start. Johann van Beethoven had become a successful businessman. A pharmacist who had made shrewd investments in property. He had also made an unforgivable choice, in his brother's eyes. He had married a woman of dubious reputation. Therese Obermeyer had borne an illegitimate child before their wedding. Ludwig had always referred to her contemptuously. He had never reconciled himself to the match. Now, thrown together under one roof, the old conflicts reignited. Ludwig quarreled with Johann. He insulted Therese. He made demands. Issued ultimatums. Created scenes. The household that was supposed to provide peaceful convalescence became another battleground. By December, Johann had had enough. He told his brother to leave. Ludwig departed in an open carriage. In the bitter cold of an Austrian winter. The journey back to Vienna took 2 days. He arrived exhausted. Chilled to the bone. Already showing signs of illness. The cold he caught on that journey would never fully heal. Within days, he was bedridden with what appeared to be pneumonia. Within weeks, the diagnosis had worsened. His liver was failing. His abdomen was swelling with fluid that would require repeated surgical drainage. The argument at Nixendorf had cost him his health. The journey home had cost him his life. The doctors who attended Ludwig in his final months did not fully understand what was killing him. They diagnosed cirrhosis of the liver. This was accurate as far as it went. They performed 4 separate operations to drain fluid from his abdomen. A procedure that provided temporary relief but could not address the underlying disease. Modern science has given us a more complete picture. In 2023 and 2024, researchers conducted DNA analysis on authenticated locks of Beethoven's hair. The results were revealing. His genome showed genetic markers associated with liver disease, a hereditary predisposition that made him vulnerable to cirrhosis. More significantly, the analysis detected the presence of hepatitis B, a viral infection that attacks the liver. In combination with alcohol consumption, it can be devastating. The hair samples also showed extremely high levels of lead, hundreds of times higher than normal. Lead poisoning was common in the early 19th century. The metal was used in everything from wine casks to medicinal treatments to water pipes. Ludwig, who drank heavily and lived in an environment saturated with lead, had accumulated enough of the toxin to cause serious damage. So what killed him? The answer is not a single cause but a combination. Genetic vulnerability, viral infection, chronic alcohol consumption, environmental poisoning. His body had been under assault from multiple directions for decades. By the winter of 1826, it simply gave out. Some have speculated about deliberate poisoning, a murder mystery hidden in the historical record. Who might have wanted him dead? His secretary Schindler, who would control his legacy? His nephew Karl, who had already tried to escape through suicide? His brother Johann? The evidence does not support these theories. The lead in his system came from environmental sources, not from a poisoner's hand. The hepatitis was a common infection of the era. The alcohol was self-administered. Ludwig van Beethoven was killed by his times, his habits, and his genes. Not by any human enemy. But the conspiracy theories persist. Because a murder is more dramatic than a disease. We want the death of a genius to mean something. To be caused by something more interesting than liver failure. The truth is simpler and sadder. He drank too much. Lived in a toxic environment. Contracted a virus. Had bad genes. His body failed. He died. In his final weeks, he continued to work. Even as doctors drained liters of fluid from his abdomen. Even as his strength faded and his body deteriorated. He sketched ideas for future compositions. He would never complete them. But he could not stop trying. His friends visited when they could. They wrote in the conversation books, offering comfort, bringing news of the outside world, trying to ease his passage. Some brought gifts. One friend arranged for a case of fine wine to be delivered to the dying man. When it arrived, Ludwig looked at the bottles and managed a final joke. Pity, pity, too late. He was right. He could barely swallow by then, let alone appreciate good wine. But the dark humor was characteristic. Even facing death, he could not resist a bitter quip. Karl did not come. The nephew for whom he had fought so hard. The boy he had loved so destructively. He stayed away during the final illness. Whether this was cruelty or self-preservation is difficult to say. Perhaps Karl could not bear to watch his uncle die. Perhaps he could not forgive the torment that had driven him to turn a gun on himself. Perhaps he simply could not face another scene of emotional intensity. Whatever the reason, Ludwig died without seeing him again. On the 26th of March, 1827, a thunderstorm broke over Vienna. Witnesses described it as apocalyptic. Lightning splitting the sky. Thunder shaking the buildings. Rain hammering the streets. In his apartment, Ludwig lay unconscious. His breathing had become shallow, irregular. The end was clearly near. Only one person was present at the moment of death. Anselm Huttenbrenner. A composer and admirer who had sat vigil through the final hours. According to his account, written later, the unconscious man suddenly opened his eyes. A flash of lightning illuminated the room. Ludwig raised his right fist toward the ceiling. Toward the heavens. Toward the storm. Toward something only he could see. And then he fell back. Dead. The gesture became famous. The dying genius, shaking his fist at fate. Defying God with his final breath. It is almost certainly romanticized. Shaped by Huttenbrenner's memory and the expectations of a legend-hungry age. But it captures something true about the man. He had spent his life fighting. Against his deafness. Against social barriers that constrained him. Against the demons of his own psychology. If anyone would shake his fist at a thunderstorm while dying, it was Ludwig van Beethoven. 3 days later, on the 29th of March, 1827, Vienna buried its most famous citizen. The funeral procession drew an estimated 20,000 mourners. Nearly 1 in 15 of the city's entire population. They filled the streets from the apartment where he had died to the parish church of the Holy Trinity, where the service was held. They pushed and shoved to get closer to the coffin. Some fainted in the crush. Others wept openly. Schools closed. Shops shuttered. The city came to a standstill. Among the torchbearers was a young composer named Franz Schubert. He had idolized the master but never quite managed to make his acquaintance. Despite living in the same city for years. Despite moving in overlapping musical circles. Schubert would die just 19 months later. At 31. Leaving his own legacy of unfinished masterpieces. On this March day, he walked alongside the coffin of the man whose shadow had dominated his entire creative life. The actor Heinrich Anschutz delivered the funeral oration at the cemetery gates. The words were written by Franz Grillparzer, Austria's greatest playwright. They attempted to sum up a life that resisted summary. He was an artist, but also a man in the highest sense of the word. He withdrew from the world because he found no weapon but art to oppose it. He was solitary because he found no second self. But until his death, he preserved a human heart for all men, a father's heart for his own. The phrase, "a father's heart for his own," must have struck some listeners as ironic. They knew about Karl. They knew about the suicide attempt. They knew that the great man's love had been a kind of prison. But funeral orations are not the place for such complications. Grillparzer gave the crowd what it needed. A portrait of isolated genius, misunderstood by the world but faithful to his art. It was true, as far as it went. It was not the whole truth. After the service, the coffin was carried to the Waring Cemetery and lowered into the ground. The mourners dispersed. The city returned to its ordinary business. But something had changed. The world had lost a voice that would never be replaced. While they carried the coffin through the streets, someone reached into the open casket and cut a lock of hair from the dead man's head. It was the beginning of a macabre commerce. In the days and years that followed, locks of Beethoven's hair appeared throughout Europe. Sold as relics of the genius. Most were probably fraudulent. Anyone with dark hair and scissors could create a memento for gullible collectors. But some were genuine. Snipped from the corpse before burial. Or from the exhumed remains during later transfers. The hair would eventually provide crucial evidence about his death. DNA analysis in the 21st century confirmed authenticity of certain samples. Revealed his hepatitis B infection. Documented the lead poisoning that had contributed to his deterioration. The morbid souvenir trade of the 19th century yielded scientific data 200 years later. But the cutting of the locks also symbolized something about how the world would treat his memory. Ludwig van Beethoven, the man, had been difficult. Unpleasant. Often cruel. Ludwig van Beethoven, the legend, was infinitely marketable. The legend could be packaged, sold, commemorated, mythologized. The man could finally be forgotten. And in many ways, he was. The Beethoven that most people know, the heroic deaf composer, the tortured genius, the romantic hero, is a construction of the 19th century imagination. The real man, with his paranoia and his rage and his destroyed nephew, has been smoothed away. This narrative has tried to restore some of the rough edges. Not to diminish his genius, which remains undeniable. But to remember that genius does not excuse cruelty. The same hands that wrote the Ninth Symphony also signed petitions to strip a mother of her child. The same mind that conceived Ode to Joy also conceived a campaign of surveillance and control that drove a teenager to put a pistol to his head. We can hold both truths at once. We must, if we want to understand him. Carl van Beethoven survived. The bullet from his suicide attempt remained lodged in his skull until the end. The doctors had deemed it too dangerous to remove. He carried it with him for 32 years. A permanent reminder of the day he had chosen death over his uncle's love. After recovering from his injuries, he joined the army. He served for several years. Then left military service and settled into civilian life. He married in 1832. A woman named Caroline Nasky. They had 5 children together. He never spoke publicly about his uncle. When visitors inquired about the great man, he deflected with practiced phrases. Or simply changed the subject. He destroyed much of their correspondence. Created distance between himself and the mythology that had consumed his youth. Was this erasure an act of self-protection? Or of revenge? Did he burn the papers to spare his children the burden of the past? Or to express a final rejection of the man who had tormented him? We cannot know. The silences in the historical record are as eloquent as the documents that survive. He lived until 1858. Dying at 52. Younger than his uncle but older than many in that era of infectious disease and limited medicine. His obituaries mentioned his famous relative, of course. They always did. But they also recorded a quiet life. A stable family. A peaceful death. He had achieved what Ludwig never could. Contentment. He had a wife. Children. A home. He had the normalcy that his uncle had never achieved. And had prevented Karl from finding during those terrible years of guardianship. Karl survived. He built a life. He did not become great. But he became something his uncle never managed. He became happy. Or at least content. He escaped the prison and found his way to something like freedom. Perhaps that is triumph enough. The three women most often proposed as the immortal beloved all outlived the composer. Josephine von Brunswick died in 1821. 6 years before Ludwig. Worn out by illness and unhappiness. Her second marriage to Count Stackelberg had been a disaster. He abandoned her. Left her in poverty. Contested custody of their children. The pattern of her life seemed to be one of choosing badly. Or being forced to choose by circumstances beyond her control. Her daughter Minona, whose paternity remains uncertain, grew up to lead a quiet life. She never married. Never had children. Never left much mark on the historical record. If she was indeed Ludwig's daughter, as some researchers believe, the secret died with her. No DNA test has ever been conducted on her descendants. The question remains open. Antony Brentano returned to Frankfurt with her husband. She lived until 1869. Surviving into her late 80s. She and Franz maintained their marriage. Raised their children. Never publicly acknowledged any impropriety with the composer. Whatever had happened between her and Ludwig, if anything had happened, remained hidden behind the facade of respectability. She kept his portrait. And certain letters. And memories she shared with no one. In her final years, she spoke occasionally of the time she had spent in Vienna. Of the remarkable people she had known. But she revealed nothing definitive. The secret, if there was one, went to her grave. Therese von Brunswick, Josephine's sister, outlived them all. She died in 1861. Having spent decades as a pioneering educator and advocate for early childhood development. She founded kindergartens in Hungary. Corresponded with educational reformers across Europe. Her work in this field was more significant than any romantic connection she might have had. She and Ludwig had maintained a friendship until his death. Exchanging letters and occasional visits. Some have seen romantic undertones in their correspondence. But the evidence is thin. More likely, they were simply friends. Two people who had known each other in youth and maintained the connection into middle age. Therese never married. Neither did her sister Charlotte. The Brunswick family, for all its aristocratic distinction, produced few descendants. The line dwindled and eventually died out. Taking with it whatever secrets the sisters had shared. The mystery of the immortal beloved remains unsolved. Josephine von Brunswick has the strongest claim. The 13 surviving letters prove the depth of his feeling. The timing of her daughter's birth is suggestive. Modern scholars increasingly favor her as the most likely candidate. But we cannot prove it conclusively. We may never know for certain who inspired those 3 desperate pages written in the middle of a July night in 1812. Perhaps it does not finally matter. The letter exists. The emotion it expresses is real. Whatever woman inspired it, or whatever ideal constructed from multiple relationships, the longing speaks across 2 centuries. We recognize it. We have felt it ourselves. In our own ways. For our own unattainable beloveds. The letter is about love. And love, as Ludwig knew better than most, does not always require a name. Why do we love him? The question seems almost absurd. His music speaks for itself. Needs no justification. Requires no biographical context to move us. But we are fascinated by the man as well as the music. By the story as well as the sound. Perhaps it is because he embodies a fantasy of transcendence. Here was someone who lost the sense most essential to his art. And yet continued to create masterpieces. Here was someone who faced impossible obstacles and refused to surrender. Here was someone who shook his fist at the heavens and made them listen. We want to believe that such triumph is possible. We want to believe that genius can overcome any limitation. That the human spirit is stronger than the human body. That greatness is available to those with sufficient will. But there is another side to the story. Ludwig van Beethoven was not only a hero. He was also a tyrant. Petty. Paranoid. Controlling. Cruel. He damaged the people closest to him. He drove his nephew to attempt suicide. He waged a 5-year war against a woman whose only crime was being the mother of a child he wanted for himself. Can we love the music while acknowledging the man's failures? Can we admire the Ninth Symphony while remembering what he did to Karl? Can we hear Ode to Joy without thinking of the joy he denied to others? Perhaps the answer is that his music represents not who he was but who he wished to be. In composition, he escaped his worst impulses. On the page, he achieved the generosity, the transcendence, the universal love that eluded him in daily life. The music is his apology to the world. The gift he gave to compensate for all the damage he inflicted. The man he could have been, preserved and sound, offered to generations he would never meet. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps we can accept the gift without forgiving the giver. Perhaps we can be moved by Ode to Joy while acknowledging that the man who wrote it did not live joyfully. The music remains. The complications remain. Both are part of his legacy. A final image. The Concert Hall in Vienna. May 1824. The Ninth Symphony has just concluded. The audience is on its feet. Cheering. Weeping. The deaf composer stands with his back to them. Still conducting music that has already stopped. A woman touches his shoulder. Turns him around. He sees what he cannot hear. In that moment, he is connected to the world. Despite everything. Despite the silence. Despite the isolation. Despite the cruelty and the paranoia and the failed relationships. His music has done what he could never do in person. It has reached other human beings and moved them to tears. This is what endures. Not the lawsuits. Not the letters. not the conversation books with their record of daily irritations. The music. The sound he created out of silence. The joy he composed out of suffering. The brotherhood he imagined despite his solitude. He could not hear the applause. But he could see the faces. And perhaps, for one moment, that was enough. In a drawer in a Viennese apartment, a letter lay folded for 15 years. 3 pages, written in the middle of the night. Addressed to a woman whose name was never recorded. My angel, my all, my very self, it began. Ever thine. Ever mine. Ever ours. He never sent it. He could not bring himself to risk the rejection. To expose the vulnerability. To reach across the silence toward another human being. He kept the letter instead. Reading it sometimes in his lonely rooms. Remembering the love he had felt and could not quite claim. We found it after he died. We have argued about it for 200 years. We will probably never know who inspired it. But we know what it means. It means that the genius was also a man. The titan who shook his fist at heaven also longed for a woman's embrace. The composer who proclaimed universal brotherhood also ached for one particular person to love him back. He was deaf to the world. But not to his own heart. He could not hear the applause. But he could feel the longing. He was alone, finally and completely. But he wrote those 3 pages as if writing could bridge the distance. As if words could do what music did. Connect him, for one moment, to another human soul. Ever thine. Ever mine. Ever ours. He meant it. Whether or not he sent it. Whether or not she ever knew. He meant every word. And perhaps that is the final lesson of his life. That love does not require success to be real. That longing matters even when it goes unrequited. That reaching toward another person, even if you never quite touch them, is itself a form of grace. He reached. He failed. But he reached. The letter remains. The music remains. The mystery remains. And somewhere, in a silence deeper than deafness,